Hey guys, tonight we begin with a quiet story from long ago. The kind of night when the fire barely glowed and the wind crept through cracks in the walls. Ever wonder how medieval peasants survived freezing winters in homes made of mud and straw? They didn't have heaters or blankets like ours, just clever habits, unwashed layers, and even the warmth of their animals beside them. So get comfortable, turn off the lights, get cozy, and let's drift into their world, one cold night at a time. To be fair, let's talk about the place peasants were supposed to call home. Imagine a structure made of little more than mud, straw, and a few bits of wood if you were lucky, or wealthier than most of your neighbors. This wasn't the cozy cottage from fairy tales. It was barely functional, more of a damp enclosure than a refuge from the cold. The walls, often constructed with a mix of mud and wattle, which is essentially twigs woven like a basket, did surprisingly little to keep out the bite of winter. And the roof, thatched with straw, it might look picturesque in hindsight, but in reality, it did little to block wind or stop the rain or snow from seeping in. If frostbite was a winter companion, these homes were an ungracious host. The design of these homes left a lot to be desired when it came to battling cold weather. First, the lack of insulation. There was no fluffy fiberglass padding tucked into the walls, of course. But what there was, air gaps. Plenty of them. The walls weren't tightly sealed, and when winter rolled in, gusts of icy wind could creep through every invisible fissure. Floors were often just packed earth. That's right, dirt. Sometimes with straw scattered across it for a little padding, but that straw got dirty fast. Not exactly a comforting buffer between you and the freezing ground. And here's the fun part, or not. Keeping the cold air out wasn't just hard because of structural flaws. These homes also absorbed moisture like a sponge in the wet seasons. When the damp set in, it lingered for what felt like forever. Your fortress against winter could betray you not only by letting icy drafts swirl around your feet, but also by wrapping you in a soggy chill. Think about it, being cold and damp, with no way to dry out in temperatures that hovered near freezing. It's the medieval version of a horror film. But peasants weren't helpless, and they weren't without some ingenuity. When the icy fingers of winter work their way into every crevice of your home, you get clever, or you don't survive. They stuffed the worst of the gaps and cracks with whatever they could scavenge. Old rags, wads of straw, and even manure, yes, manure, were all pressed into service. Now, manure might not sound ideal as home decor today, but it wasn't a terrible choice at the time. Once dried, it acted as a sort of insulation, plugging up drafts and minimizing at least some of the worst heat loss. Smelly? Maybe a bit. Practical? Absolutely. The other weapon against the cold was fire. A small hearth was at the center of most peasant homes, both physically and symbolically. Not only did it provide what little warmth the household could rely on, but it was used for cooking, drying clothes, and even some measure of light after sunset. That said, the hearth came with its own set of problems. For starters, chimneys weren't standard yet. Smoke didn't have a proper way out, so it lingered, filling the entire home with a hazy fog that clung to clothing and irritated lungs. While the smoke did help to preserve meat and discourage certain pests, a small silver lining, I guess, the air quality inside these homes wasn't exactly doing wonders for anyone's health. But hey, at least it wasn't as cold as it could have been. Now, imagine the constant struggle of maintaining that fire. It wasn't just about collecting enough wood. It's winter, remember. Wood might have been frozen, damp, or both. Sometimes, wood wasn't even an option. In those cases, dried animal dung did the job. Yes, we're back to manure again. A multi-purpose solution for medieval life. Still, fires were unpredictable, and keeping one alive throughout the night required constant vigilance. Without it, the home would quickly return to a bone-aching chill. Even with these efforts, the truth is that medieval houses just weren't up to the task of keeping winter out. The bitter cold seeped in regardless, and the dampness was relentless. You'd think they would have adapted the architectural designs over time, right? Not so much. There were limitations, economical, technological, or both. That meant improvement was slow or non-existent for centuries. This left peasants in a constant state of problem-solving, just to endure the most brutal seasons. Despite its impossibility as a true barrier from the winter elements, the inadequacy of housing pushed people toward creative survival tactics. If the walls and roof didn't pull their weight, people had to step in and take matters into their own hands, or better yet, into their communal existence. They relied on strategies that extended beyond the architecture itself. The house became more of a staging area for other survival methods, from layering clothing to clustering together inside cramped quarters for warmth, to managing fires with painstaking care. And in some cases, the animals they kept weren't just for food or labor. They became part of the heating system too. But that's a solution we'll explore more in a later section. For now, picture this. A tiny dark room with smoke swirling around, its earthen floor damp from weeks of rainwater creeping inside. The walls so thin that every gust of wind feels like it could knock them over. Yet generations of peasants somehow made this their home, balancing on the thin edge between survival and despair every single winter. And sure, these homes were far from ideal, but maybe they weren't meant to be entirely self-sufficient. After all, they weren't just homes. They were tools, part of a greater system of resourcefulness and creativity, designed, not perfectly, but adequately enough, to weather the storm when paired with a good helping of determination and a few unconventional hacks. So if the home wasn't enough, what else could they rely on? What lengths would peasants go to when even these fortified mud and thatch shelters failed them? The answer is both surprising and insightful, showing just how inventive people could be under harsh conditions. And if you're already dreading just the thought of life in a medieval winter, hang tight. The next solution is all about making the most of what you wear. Even if you've never thought of dirt as your best winter accessory, if you were surviving a medieval winter, your best defense against the cold wasn't warm food, roaring fires, or insulated homes. It was everything you wore on your body. Clothing, or what little people had, wasn't just a layer of fabric separating you from frostbite. It was a critical part of staying alive. But here's the catch. These clothes, they weren't washed. Not the way you're thinking, at least. Cleaning them often wasn't practical, and in many cases, it wasn't even safe, especially during the icy months. Instead, these dirty, greasy, and downright uncomfortable garments acted like second skin, albeit a scratchy, unwashed one. And believe it or not, the grime played a role in keeping you alive. Most medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of a wardrobe with staples for every season. A single outfit often had to last not just days, but weeks or even months, sometimes years. Winter didn't bring out a new collection of woolen cloaks or thick gloves. Instead, people relied on layering every single piece of clothing they owned. That might sound obvious, but the scarcity of garments meant those layers were usually limited. If you were lucky, you had at least one piece made of wool, a fabric far better suited for the cold than linen, which was too thin and airy to trap heat on its own. Wool, in comparison, was warm, durable, and, here's the key, able to retain heat even when it was damp. It was itchy beyond imagination and smelled a little off after weeks of wear. But these weren't the things that mattered when the alternative was shivering through frostbitten evenings. Now, let's touch on washing. Believe it or not, winter made the idea of regular laundry an actual survival risk. Cleaning clothes required either access to an open water source like a river, which might be frozen over, or a large amount of water that had to be heated by burning precious fuel. This was neither efficient nor safe for people with few resources. And even if you managed to wash something, drying it was another ordeal. Imagine getting your only warm layer soaking wet, then having to wait hours, maybe days, for it to air dry in freezing temperatures. Wearing it damp would chill your body even further, setting yourself up for illness. So the solution? You wore your clothes until they were practically fused to your skin. Here's where things get unexpectedly clever. Over time, clothing would accumulate grease from sweat, oils, and dirt. Does that sound gross? Absolutely. But nature had something of a silver lining here. That greasy residue actually added another layer of insulation. Dirt and oils trapped heat close to the body, creating a sort of barrier that helped to counteract against freezing temperatures. In a strange twist of fate, staying dirty could sometimes mean staying just warm enough to avoid hypothermia. Think of it as medieval life hacking. Though, let's admit, it's not the kind of hack anyone looks forward to. Of course, this natural insulation came with its own set of issues. Hygiene, as you can imagine, wasn't great. It wasn't uncommon for lice to flourish under those grimy layers, and with unwashed hair pressed against wool caps or hoods, fleas weren't far behind. If you were scratching yourself raw in the 1400s, it wasn't due to dry winter air, but most likely the unwelcome passengers thriving thanks to your survival strategy. So yes, life-saving warmth came with a cost, but few peasants had the luxury of picking cleanliness over keeping their blood circulating. Let's break down the typical layers a peasant might wear. The innermost garment was usually a linen shift or tunic, close to the skin. Thin as it was, linen worked to wick sweat and moisture away, though it wasn't great for retaining heat. Over that came a thick woolen over-tunic, which served as the primary layer for warmth. Anything beyond this depended on what you had access to. Some might add cloaks or shawls, also wool, but many were forced to make do with makeshift patchwork layers, like bits of fabric sewn together into a crude blanket they could wrap around themselves. If they were exceptionally fortunate, they might add fur trimmings, although most furs were a luxury reserved for nobles or merchants. When it came to extremities, protection was minimal but vital. Feet were often wrapped in strips of cloth before slipping into crude leather shoes, and these strips were rarely washed either. Sometimes, they'd stuff straw or even dried moss into their shoes as extra insulation. Hands were usually left bare, though mittens or gloves made from scraps of fabric, if available, were worn during work outdoors. Scarves or hoods were essential to trap heat around the neck and head, as most body heat could otherwise escape from those areas. Again, wool was the preferred material, no matter how scratchy and coarse. The irony of all this is that clothing wasn't just functional, it was strategic. Peasants knew that what they wore and how they wore it could directly determine whether they made it through the cold season alive. For example, they'd layer clothes loosely enough to leave small pockets of air between fabrics. Those little pockets acted like natural insulation, keeping warmth trapped against their skin. On especially cold nights, children or elderly family members, those most vulnerable to the cold, would sometimes borrow clothing layers from others in the household, ensuring the weakest had the best shot at surviving. Still, no amount of layering could make up for the reality of harsh medieval winters. When the frost was biting through every door and window, clothes alone couldn't cut it. That's when people turned to other methods, like sleeping in huddled groups or using heat from fires or even animals to supplement warmth. And let's not forget, you're still dealing with the difficulty of working outside in the cold. Many tasks, like farming or gathering wood, required braving freezing temperatures, so clothing had to be practical enough for movement while remaining as insulated as possible. Unsurprisingly, this balance wasn't easy to achieve. At some point, practicality nearly always outweighed concerns over hygiene. Staying alive in a world with limited resources meant wearing clothing that, by today's standards, was far from pleasant. Yet humor might have played a small part in peasant communities during this grim trial. It's easy to imagine siblings or neighbors ribbing each other over who smelled the worst after a particularly long stretch without washing. Still, no one was in a position to judge too harshly. You couldn't exactly pick and choose when the alternative to wearing filthy clothes was freezing to death. And here's the most human part of it all. Knowing that life for medieval peasants was about quiet, relentless improvisation. They learned to endure discomfort for survival, finding the most practical ways to cope even with the simplest things like clothing. These were people who didn't have the privilege of worrying about appearances or the social faux pas of unwashed garments. They had one focus: to endure winter and make it through to spring. But survival was never just about pragmatism. It was also about resourcefulness. Even when their layers of wool and linen couldn't entirely ward off the cold, medieval peasants continually improvised. They took what they could find, scraps, grease, fibers, and turned it into insulation. Even the grime they carried on their skin and clothing had a purpose in keeping them alive. For them, warmth mattered more than cleanliness, and survival mattered most of all. Of course, this practicality had its limits. Fires, insulation, and layers could only do so much, which often raised the question, what else could they rely on? When the cold stretched out past the capacity of their clothing, even the most unwashed garment wasn't enough. For those nights when there was no escape from the chill, peasants turned to heat sources that went beyond anything you'd call common. Imagine a bitter medieval winter night. The wind howls, your home is barely holding together, and the fire is your only real defense between shivering through the dark or falling prey to frostbite. Keeping that fire alive wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was life or death. But here's the problem. Firewood wasn't endless, and getting it in the middle of a freezing night wasn't exactly an option. That's where something called fire banking comes into play, a simple but ingenious method for stretching the life of a fire without burning through resources. It's not something we think about much now, but for peasants, it was a nightly ritual, one that could make or break their chance of surviving the cold. So how did it work? First, let's talk about why fire was such a big deal in a medieval household. For most peasants, fire was the closest thing they had to modern heating. Forget radiators or even stoves. The hearth was the heart of the home. It provided warmth, light, and a means to cook whatever simple meals they could manage, like pottage or bread. On freezing nights, a live fire wasn't a luxury. It was essential. Without it, the home would grow as cold inside as it was outside. Remember, we're talking about houses that weren't really insulated. The fire did all the heavy lifting, and even with it burning, the surrounding air was often less than cozy. But fires weren't automatic or easy to maintain. Every evening brought a challenge: how to keep the warmth going even though peasants didn't have access to unlimited wood, dry kindling, or obviously, modern tools like matches. Add to that the ever-present danger of the fire going out overnight, and you start to get a sense of the stress this brought on. If a fire did die, it wasn't a matter of casually relighting it. Restarting a fire meant fiddling with flint and steel, or trying to coax life into stubborn embers with frozen fingers. Not to mention, doing so while your house chilled to temperatures that made your breath hang visibly in the air. It was exhausting, it was frustrating, and it was downright dangerous. That's why firebanking became such a critical skill. Here's the basic idea. Instead of burning logs or sticks all night long, peasants would carefully bury the fire's embers under a thick layer of ash. But not just any ash. It had to be dry, fine ash, collected from previous fires. The reason? Ash acts as an insulator, trapping just enough heat to keep the embers alive without letting them burn through completely. Too little ash, and the embers might fizzle out from exposure to the air. Too much, and you could smother them entirely. It was a delicate balance, one that required a practiced hand and a lot of patience. Once the embers were banked under that blanket of ash, families could rest a little easier. The fire wouldn't be roaring, certainly, but it wouldn't go completely cold either. By the time morning rolled around, they'd dig out the still glowing coals, add kindling, and gently fan them back to life. Kindling, by the way, could be anything from dry twigs to scraps of straw or bark. Anything that would catch fire quickly without eating into larger fuel supplies. For those who successfully mastered firebanking, it meant waking up to a home that wasn't quite as freezing, a small but meaningful victory against the winter. But like most things in peasant life, firebanking was far from foolproof. Success depended heavily on technique, and skill wasn't evenly distributed. Not everyone had the knack for knowing just how much ash to use, or how deeply to bury the coals. Some families even developed specific methods passed down through generations, like insisting on a particular type of ash, or creating small mounds of earth around the hearth to protect embers from drafts. These family secrets of firebanking were so important that arguments sometimes broke out over whose method was better. In a way, it was a responsibility that tied directly into survival, and failure could have devastating consequences. And let's not sugarcoat what failure looked like. If the ember bank didn't hold overnight, the fire wasn't coming back without a fight. Relighting the hearth meant trudging out into the unforgiving cold of a medieval morning to gather kindling. And finding kindling would often be a harsh test of luck. Harsh winds, wet conditions, or snowfall could make what was already a painstaking process nearly impossible. Strong drafts could blow through a house and extinguish your work before it even started. And if you had no embers to fan to life, you'd be down to the long and careful process of striking flint and steel and praying you didn't waste precious fuel. The consequences of letting the fire fail were stark. Cold like that seeped into bones and lingered there. The youngest, oldest, and weakest members of a family were at the greatest risk. Frostbite or chilblains, painful swelling of skin exposed to the cold, became real threats. In severe cases, those cold nights could claim lives. It sounds dramatic, but a fire, banked or lost, had the power to determine the difference between endurance and tragedy. Firebanking wasn't merely a survival technique, It was a nightly ritual, a family effort that symbolized more than practicality. The process reflected communal resilience, with each family member taking on a role. Older children might be responsible for watching over embers during the night, while adults spent their evenings ensuring the ash layer was just right before heading to bed. Some households even rotated the duty of checking the hearth overnight, the sleepy equivalent of adjusting the world's least convenient thermostat. There's even an odd sense of solidarity in imagining entire villages engaged in the same quiet routines, each home banking its fire, each family whispering hope into the dark. The ingenuity of fire banking, though undeniably low-tech, highlighted the adaptive resourcefulness of medieval peasants. Ash, the byproduct of earlier fires, became not just trash, but treasure in this context. Reusing it as insulation demonstrated a conservation mindset that modern sustainability advocates might admire. By carefully preserving coals and minimizing waste, peasants stretched resources further than you might think possible. They didn't have the luxury of excess firewood or the ability to waste time gathering unnecessary supplies. Fire banking was efficient, clever, and in its way, reliable, assuming the technique was executed properly. But even then, this wasn't the whole solution. A single ember could do a lot, but it couldn't do everything. When fire banking alone wasn't enough to ease the chill, people looked to other ingenious ways of adding warmth. When the embers slept under ash, the house may have been quiet, but the cold kept creeping in. So, what else could they rely on? The answer brings us even closer to the heart of medieval survival. Heat sources that were alive, literally. Families often turned to the warmth of livestock, bundling closer to animals for an added buffer of body-generated heat. And yes, it might sound strange now, but when the choice was between freezing and pressing closer to a cow or goat, practicality won every time. Fire banking, though just one survival tactic, was a cornerstone of medieval winter living. It was a small act of control, a way to fight back against nature's relentless cold without wasting all your resources. Waking up to that warm ember still glowing in a bed of ash was more than just relief. It was proof that you'd outsmarted the night. And sure, it wasn't glamorous or foolproof, but for medieval peasants, it might have been the closest thing to hope you could find in the heart of winter. When winter nights were at their coldest, medieval peasants often found themselves sharing precious living space with some unexpected company: livestock. Now, if you've ever spent even 5 minutes near a barn, you probably have some questions. Why would anyone willingly invite pigs, chickens, or a full-grown cow into their home? The answer is as practical as it is unglamorous. Survival. During winter, specifically at night, bringing animals indoors was one of the most effective and accessible ways to keep a house warm. Sure, it meant noise, smells, and waking up to new and unpleasant surprises underfoot, but for peasants, it was better than freezing. Let's be clear, this wasn't some picturesque scene of a cozy farmhouse with animals peacefully resting in the corner. A typical peasant home wasn't big enough to accommodate sprawling human comfort, let alone animal luxury. These houses were one-room structures, designed for function, not space. Mud, straw, and wattle walls stretched only so far when it came to blocking out the cold. Wind blew in through the cracks, and the damp from the ground crept up into every corner. For most families, the fire barely offered enough warmth to cut through the endless chill. That's where the animals came in. Their body heat was essentially a free heater. And in a home where every degree mattered, even a goat could make a difference. But bringing animals indoors wasn't without its challenges. First off, let's talk about the smell. Sharing your sleeping space with a cow or pig wasn't a situation you describe as aromatic. As the seasons wore on, the combined odors of damp humans, smoke, and livestock created an environment that the spring thaw wasn't quick to erase. The smells were, as one source puts it, legendary. If you could step into one of these homes after a long season of cohabitation, your nose might have simply given up in protest. But for peasants, it was tolerable. Ultimately, the scent of survival was better than the numb cold of frost. You adapt when the alternative is freezing. Then there was the issue of noise. Chickens settling in for the night weren't always quiet, and some, lacking respect for routine, might crow long before dawn. Goats had a habit of being restless and vocal, while pigs, let's just say pigs, aren't known for their house manners. For every degree of much-needed warmth, there was some trade-off in sleep quality or sanity. It wasn't uncommon for peasants to be woken up by the clucking of a chicken perched somewhere it wasn't supposed to be, or the sound of a pig rooting noisily in the straw. Health risks also came with the territory. Diseases didn't discriminate between humans and animals, and sharing close quarters heightened the risk of infections hopping across species. Add to that the pests, fleas for instance, happily making themselves at home in this crowded environment, and it wasn't exactly an Instagram-worthy level of rustic living. Still, these hazards weren't enough to outweigh the benefits. When even the heartiest soul struggled to keep warm, a cow's steady, radiating warmth felt like a lifeline. Cows were some of the most common animal guests indoors. Their sheer size made them excellent heat sources, practically radiators with hooves. Peasants would often position cows as close to the family sleeping space as possible, maximizing the shared heat. Goats ranked high on the list too, mostly because they were smaller and easier to manage. But goats, being goats, tended to invite themselves in with or without permission. If you've ever interacted with a goat, you know, these creatures have their way of getting where they want to be. Chickens rounded out the household menagerie, often roosting in rafters, old baskets, or wherever they could find a spot off the ground. And then there were the pigs. They made no such attempt to be delicate about their presence, usually sprawling directly on the floor, leaving little room for negotiation. So how did families manage this arrangement? Space was already limited, but with strategic setup, it kind of worked. The hearth, or central fire, was the focal point of the home, and animals were often positioned around the edges of this small shared area. People and animals alike huddled close to conserve heat while remaining just far enough from the fire to avoid accidents. Bedding for humans often consisted of straw or hay laid directly on the dirt floor, and it wasn't uncommon for livestock to lie down only a few feet away, sometimes closer. Chickens might pocket themselves into snug nooks out of reach of wandering feet, while larger animals stayed in designated corners. Designated is used generously here though, because the reality was messy. A pig would flop down wherever it pleased, and if that happened to be in the middle of the room, you learned to step around it. Of course, this raises an important question. With animals taking up so much space indoors, where did the people sleep? The short answer is everywhere. Families adapted their sleeping arrangements based on circumstance. Small children might use their parents' bedding as extra insulation, while older kids nestled near the warmest animal. Family members slept tightly packed to share body heat, sometimes positioning themselves alongside their own livestock. It wasn't uncommon for someone to wake up with a chicken feather in their hair or a pig snuffling close by. These were the realities of survival, not comfort. And for the most part, no one complained. Not with frost clinging to the ragged edges of the house just beyond their small circle of warmth. While modern living keeps animals far outside our homes, bringing livestock indoors was about more than heat. It was an extension of the communal mindset that defined peasant life. Everyone, human or animal, played a role in survival. A home that housed goats, chickens, and cows, along with its human occupants, was alive with shared purpose. The animals weren't just there for warmth. They were a source of food, labor, and livelihood. They were an integral part of the peasant household, not separate from it. The arrangement reflected a deeper interdependence, the understanding that survival required compromise and cooperation. Practicality always outweighed personal discomfort. Would you put up with smells, noise, and the risk of stepping on something unpleasant at midnight if the reward was waking up unfrostbitten? For peasants, the answer was always yes. As one source notes, the more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. It wasn't luxury, far from it, but it kept families alive during the harshest nights. Every animal brought indoors meant another layer of protection against the cold. Still, there was an inevitable trade-off. By the time winter loosened its grip and spring started to peek around the corner, the house carried the unmistakable signature of its recent inhabitants. The smells and stains were reminders of the long, shared battle against the elements. And yet, when it came time to clean up, the thought was less about regret and more about relief. Spring had arrived, and the livestock could finally return to their outdoor spaces. For a time, things shifted back to normal, until the next winter came and the cycle began again. When you think about it, this practice, welcoming livestock into your home, says a lot about how resourceful and resilient medieval peasants really were. It wasn't neat, it wasn't glamorous, and it certainly didn't offer much in the way of convenience, but it worked. And in a world where surviving the night often came down to how warmly you could bundle yourself, a slightly slobbery breath from a nearby cow wasn't a nuisance, it was reassurance. Survival, once again, came down to embracing whatever solutions could be found, even if that solution had 4 legs and a fittingly messy habit of nosing through straw at 3 in the morning. How many people can you fit into a medieval bed? The answer, as strange as it may seem, wasn't so much about numbers, it was about survival. When a room could barely hold the family as it was, and the fire sputtered its last bit of warmth for the night, it came down to one brutally effective solution. Everyone huddled together, not for fun, not for comfort, but to stay alive. Communal sleeping wasn't just a cultural quirk. It was a critical tactic in surviving those frozen months, relying on one of the simplest and most renewable heat sources known to humankind, the human body. Let's picture it. Medieval beds weren't the generous, fluffy oases we know today. The idea of a mattress filled with springs or foam, or even one that didn't collapse after a single winter, would have been a laughable luxury. Instead, peasant beds were little more than sacks stuffed with straw, hay, or rushes. These crude mattresses were laid directly on the cold, hard floor, or, if the household had a bit more in terms of resources, placed within a rough wooden frame. The problem? Those natural fillers flattened quickly under the weight of one person, let alone multiple sleepers. Before long, the bedding resembled a crunchy, lumpy mess that offered just enough padding to keep you from lying directly on the dirt. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was also high maintenance. Straw and hay attracted fleas and other pests, and when damp crept into its fibers, mold had an open invitation to join the party. But warmth took priority over everything. So straw stuffed in sacks it was, and everyone crammed together to make the most of it. There wasn't much in the way of personal space during these long, dark nights. Entire households, sometimes consisting of several generations, would pile into the available bedding. And believe it or not, it wasn't just family. On occasion, neighbors, those in the most desperate need of warmth, might find themselves welcomed into the fray. It sounds chaotic, and it was. Nothing about squeezing multiple adults, children, and sometimes animals into one cramped sleeping area was comfortable, but it was effective. Body heat circulated like a life-saving current, helping everyone fend off the bite of sub-freezing air that surrounded the rudimentary walls. Now, if you're imagining a quiet, peaceful slumber party, it wasn't. Cue the snoring, coughing, sneezing, and general shuffling of bodies rearranging themselves for the least awful sleeping position. The scents? Well, let's just say they were unforgettable. Hygiene wasn't exactly a strong point in the medieval peasant world. Layers of unwashed clothes, livestock that had spent the day inside the same room, and dampness that hung stubbornly in the air made for a blend that can only be described as harsh. Throw in the fact that bathing was infrequent in the best of times and practically unheard of during the winter, and you've got yourself a sensory experience no one was signing up for voluntarily. Even so, the strategic brilliance of communal sleeping can't be ignored. Heat, after all, was the goal. By clustering together, peasants turned their bodies into the equivalent of a medieval heating system. The more bodies crammed into the bed, the better the heat retention. Placement was intentional too. The youngest, oldest, and frailest family members were tucked into the very center of the group, where they'd have the highest chance of staying warm. These were often babies, the elderly, or those already sick from the season's relentless cold. In a cruel twist of fate, those who most needed the warmth couldn't always generate much of their own, so they relied on the radiating heat of others. Peasants in good health, the strongest and most resilient, were typically stationed on the outer edges, acting as buffers to the cold drafts slipping through the cracks in the walls. Here's where the social and physical dynamics of survival really came into play. Being on the edge wasn't fun. It meant the icy tendrils of nighttime air crept over your shoulders and down your back, while everyone else benefited from the cocoon of warmth deeper in. But someone had to take the hit, and these sorts of unspoken agreements were part of the survival code. It wasn't about fairness, it was about practicality. Stronger bodies could endure the exposure long enough to keep the center warm. The discomfort was constant, but the rewards, waking up with all your fingers and toes intact, far outweighed the awkwardness of sleeping shoulder to shoulder or hip to hip. And within these cramped quarters, survival wasn't the only thing happening. Long winter nights in a medieval household often stretched hours beyond what you'd call bedtime. With little else to do, huddling in the dark became an unexpected backdrop for bonding. Families told stories, sang songs, or simply recounted the events of the day. It wasn't cheerful, necessarily, but it was connecting. Survival required more than effort. It depended on relationships too. The survival bed wasn't just a space for warmth. It was a symbol of how deeply peasants depended on one another, not just physically, but emotionally. But here's the reality check. Not all of these arrangements came with idealized moments of unity. Discomfort, annoyance, and sheer exhaustion undoubtedly simmered just beneath the surface. Sharing your already limited space with a mix of different personalities, each with their quirks, was bound to lead to friction. Did someone hog more space than their fair share? Probably. It's easy to imagine the quiet frustrations boiling over when confined to such tight quarters for days or weeks on end. Yet the cold had a way of putting these minor grievances into perspective. If the alternative was an empty bed and a frostbitten morning, you'd let a loud snore or well-placed elbow slide more times than you'd like. The communal bed wasn't just human either. As we've already explored, livestock was often dragged inside for extra heat. During the harshest nights, it wasn't uncommon for animals to sidle close or right into these sleeping arrangements, adding their own body heat to the mix. Chickens, goats, pigs, or even the occasional cow might find their place in the ad hoc jungle of limbs. Strangely, or maybe not so strangely, peasants didn't seem to mind much. If living foot to hoof with livestock kept the worst of winter's wrath at bay, then so be it. The downside to these arrangements, aside from comfort or cleanliness, was the long-term effect on health. With so many bodies packed into a poorly ventilated space, illnesses spread fast. Coughs bounced from child to elder and back again, and lice seemed to thrive in these conditions. It wasn't ideal, but with limited resources and survival at stake, prioritizing warmth over hygiene wasn't negotiable. And really, there wasn't much else to do about it. Flea infestations and bad air were part of the cost of making it through the season. Still, even with all its flaws, the survival bed quite literally saved lives. It kept peasants alive long enough to see the return of warmer days, proving that even the simplest, humblest solutions could be the most effective. Shared body heat was as vital to winter survival as food or fire, and the communal bed combined both necessity and creativity to stave off the cold's relentless grip. It might have been uncomfortable, noisy, and crowded, but it worked, leaving little room for complaints when survival was the clear priority. Of course, warmth didn't end with huddling. Peasants were resourceful, and the fight against the cold didn't stop when everyone was tucked in together. From hot rocks buried under covers to straw-packed bedding tricks, there was always another layer of creativity ready to be unearthed, sometimes quite literally. And as we move forward, it's worth noting, medieval winters weren't just endured. They were conquered step by step, one practical, communal solution at a time. How did medieval peasants heat their beds without setting the entire house on fire? It wasn't thanks to some mystical medieval innovation, but to something you can find in your backyard. Stones. That's right. Hot stones were the go-to solution for warming up before sleep, and though the method was deceptively simple, it was also surprisingly effective. It was a small victory against the unrelenting cold that turned nights into an endurance test. But the process itself, we're talking glowing hot rocks, burlap cloth and straw, wasn't exactly without its risks. When winter left you relying on basic survival skills, a little creativity could be the difference between comfort and catastrophe. Here's how it worked. First, a flat, hefty stone or two was placed directly into the household hearth, the only reliable source of heat in the peasant home. The fire itself was likely modest. It had to be, given the strain of keeping it supplied with wood. But it did the job of superheating the rock over time. Timing was key. Too soon, and the stone wouldn't retain heat for very long. Too long, and you'd risk burning yourself or the sparse materials around it when moving it to the bed. Afterward, the stone was carefully extracted from the embers using tongs, sticks, or whatever basic tools were available, because no one wanted to accidentally grab it with their hands. You might think getting a rock out of a fire sounds simple, but for peasants, there was a skill to it. A misplaced hand or an unstable tool, and the situation could go from uncomfortable to downright dangerous in seconds. Once out of the fire, the stone was wrapped in layers of cloth, usually some worn rags or burlap. This wasn't just about comfort, but safety, creating a buffer to prevent the hot surface from making direct contact with the bedding, or worse, skin. Unwrapped, the stone could easily scorch straw mattresses, triggering a fire that would be disastrous in a cramped wooden house. The wrapping also helped regulate the stone's heat, allowing it to release warmth gradually, making it an ideal nighttime solution. From that point, the stone was tucked into the sleeping area, under the straw mattress, nestled at the foot of the bed, or even placed right between people if the night was especially bitter. It's hard to imagine this setup in today's world, where even a chilly night usually comes with central heating or at least an electric blanket. But in a peasant home, this method wasn't just practical, it was necessary. Straw mattresses stuffed into a creaky wooden bed frame offered little in the way of insulation, and nighttime temperatures often plunged to freezing levels. A hot stone changed the game, creating not just a patch of warmth, but a kind of psychological relief. If you knew the bitter cold wouldn't completely steal into the bed, you could relax just a little and focus on sleeping through one more long, difficult night. Of course, this hack wasn't foolproof. There was a delicate balance between success and small disaster, and peasants had to watch out for plenty of potential slip-ups. If the wrapping wasn't done properly, a heated stone could burn through the layers, damaging mattresses or blankets, or even causing burns. Dropping the stone entirely wasn't unheard of either, especially if the process was rushed or someone tried to handle the stone before it was cool enough. Then there was the constant fear of an ember catching in the hay-filled bedding. Fires in medieval homes weren't uncommon, and given how flammable everything in a peasant house was, straw, wood, burlap, it's no surprise that people treated any method involving heat with a degree of caution, especially at night. Yet, despite these risks, the hot stone method was a lifesaver. You had to be careful, sure, but when stacked up against the alternative of going to bed in a half-frozen room, the choice seemed pretty obvious. Plus, it wasn't a standalone solution. In the medieval playbook of cold weather survival, every small method worked as part of a larger strategy. The hot stone, for instance, paired perfectly with the layering system peasants used for their bedding. A typical bed was first covered with straw, hay, or rushes, materials chosen for their insulating properties, though not exactly for luxury or comfort. Blankets made from coarse wool could be added on top, heavy but essential for keeping the chill at bay. The heated stone would then go under all of this or right at the foot of the bed, relying on the layers to spread its warmth while keeping everyone safe from direct contact. In many ways, medieval peasants treated warmth like a limited resource, something to stretch as far as humanly possible. If the stone lasted a few extra hours into the night, that was a small triumph. Some households even had their own tricks to improve the system. Wrapping the stone in more layers helped it retain heat longer, while particularly determined families might use more than one stone, strategically placing them to warm multiple spots in the bed. And it wasn't just people who benefited. Straw pallets used for livestock sometimes got their own heated stones to create cozier resting places for animals brought indoors during the coldest months. After all, warm livestock meant healthier livestock, and animals were too valuable to lose to the winter chill. But even with this team effort of straw, wool, and glowing rocks, some nights were just too cold for it to matter. Heated stones had their limits, and there were surely cruel evenings where it felt like the cold had the upper hand, no matter what you tried. What then? Winter survival didn't come with a guarantee. Stones cooled too fast, straw flattened or even froze if dampness crept into the home. And if the combination of tricks and techniques couldn't overpower the sheer force of the weather, all anyone could do was shiver through the night and wait desperately for daylight. The harsh truth of peasant life was that sometimes survival depended less on ingenuity and more on sheer luck. Still, this stone heating practice says something remarkable about the ingenuity of medieval peasants. It wasn't flashy, and it certainly came with risks, but it worked. It was a solution born out of necessity and simplicity, using what was available to solve an immediate, urgent problem. In a world where the odds were constantly stacked against you, and every resource felt finite, these small victories mattered. Heating a stone and easing some of your family's suffering, even for a few hours, meant one less thing to fight against. The heated stone method also highlighted an important truth about medieval life. Survival was a patchwork process. You pulled together little solutions to scrape your way through brutally cold conditions, knowing no single trick was going to do the job on its own. The fire in the hearth, the unwashed layers of woolen clothing, the huddle of bodies crowded into a bed too small, it all fed into the same goal. The hot stone wasn't about comfort or convenience, but survival. And in the dim glow of a medieval home, it might have felt like a small miracle. At the end of the day, this little hack didn't just provide warmth, it provided agency. For peasants trapped in homes with no heat, stone warming rituals were a reminder that even in the face of nature's most brutal forces, you could outsmart the cold, at least for a little while. And for all its rough edges and risks, it carried the weight of resilience, proving again and again how much impact a simple, thoughtful idea could have in the fight against the relentless frost of winter nights. What happens when a fire dies out in the dead of winter? The short answer: nothing good. For medieval peasants, losing a fire overnight wasn't just inconvenient, it was a full-blown crisis. Without the constant warmth of the hearth, the cold quickly became unbearable, and a bad situation could spiral into something dangerous. Letting the fire go out meant inviting frostbite, illness, and in the worst cases, death. It wasn't just about keeping a house slightly warmer. It was about making it through the night alive. Picture this. Outside, the wind howls with an icy edge that never seems to pause. Inside, your fire has fizzled to nothing, leaving a pile of blackened wood and smothered embers in its place. The cold takes its cue, creeping through every gap in the wattle and daub walls. These houses, already poorly insulated, are now wide open to the elements. The floor, made of nothing but packed earth, feels like ice beneath your thin straw covering. Even if you're curled up under layers of grubby wool and straw-filled mattresses, the chill reaches you. It wraps around you, stealing any warmth you've managed to hold on to. This isn't just discomfort we're talking about. Prolonged exposure to such cold could lead to frostbite, or worse, hypothermia. For the very young or the very old, both of which had weaker defenses, a night like this could be fatal. Now, if you think reigniting a fire was as simple as striking a match, think again. Rebuilding a fire from scratch in freezing temperatures was no easy task. First, you'd need the tools: flint, steel, and dry, reliable kindling. Small twigs or straw were common, but finding dry ones in winter, a challenge all on its own. Add a biting wind or numb fingers, and you've got a recipe for frustration. Failing to keep a fire alive during the night also meant wasting time and resources in the bitter morning light, desperately sparking life back into the hearth while the family struggled to stay warm. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was exhausting. And at a time of year when energy and resources were already scarce, this was a potentially disastrous setback. The fire might have been the center of daily medieval life, but it transformed into something much more symbolic on the coldest nights. It wasn't just a source of heat, it was hope. A glowing hearth represented persistence, routine, and the fight against nature's cruelest months. For many families, waking up to a still burning ember was referred to as a minor miracle. A cold, lifeless hearth, however, was a stark reminder of the fragile boundaries between survival and despair. Take firebanking, for example. It may not sound glamorous, but mastering it was a vital skill. Before bed, families would carefully bank their embers under ash, trying to trap the heat without fully extinguishing them. If done correctly, those embers could smolder quietly until morning. But it wasn't foolproof. Use too little ash, and the embers burned out too soon. Use too much, and you'd smother them completely. Add a sudden draft, a gust of wind sneaking through the leaks in the wall, or an animal's clumsy paw, and you'd find yourself waking up to nothing but cold ash. Peasants didn't just sleep soundly through the night either. Someone, often an older child or the most alert adult, would take shifts checking the hearth, ensuring the embers hadn't been disturbed. It was vigilance born out of necessity. But sometimes, despite their best efforts, firekeeping failed. And when that happened, the household had to get creative fast. One common solution: borrowing fire from a neighbor. This wasn't as simple as walking next door, knocking on the door, and asking for a light. Even neighbors didn't have fire to spare during the depths of winter. If they did share, it was usually a carefully bundled ember, wrapped in rags and rushed back home to reignite the hearth, without letting it cool on the way. In return, you might owe them a share of future wood, or a favor down the line. It was a system based on interdependence, people pooling resources because there was no room for isolation when survival demanded collaboration. Sometimes, neighbors took things a step further. If a family couldn't manage to rebuild their fire, they might be invited into another home for the night. For a peasant household, already cramped and smoky, this was quite a gesture. Adding one or two more people to the room brought with it noise, smells, and the awkward shuffle of everyone trying to fit into a limited space. But the agreements were made, spoken or not. This wasn't just generosity, it was about shared survival. Another set of bodies meant more heat circulating in the house. Another set of hands meant help in the daily grind of firekeeping. However, this communal safety net wasn't always an option. In truly brutal winters, there was only so much neighbors could do. If fuel ran out or resources stretched too thin, even a strong community couldn't save every family. That's when you hear the grimmest stories, the moments when desperation sets in. People would resort to eating whatever they could find, scraping mold off food or boiling roots until they were edible. Others turned to leather, cutting strips from old shoes or belts to chew on. And while it's hard to confirm every harrowing account, there are whispers of families who reached the very edge, the kind of decisions you only make when you're faced with nothing but the sheer will to survive. But it wasn't just the cold or lack of food that caused harm. Disease flourished when the fire went out, especially since smoke-filled homes, for all their discomfort, had their benefits. Smoky air deterred certain pests like fleas and lice, which thrived in the absence of fire. A family without heat didn't just freeze, they also became more vulnerable to illnesses, turning an already brutal winter into an unforgiving one. Cramped homes, combined with the cold and weakened immune systems, became breeding grounds for infections that could spread quickly. Still, stories of recovery highlight the resilience of these communities. A failed fire wasn't always the end. Families that endured were often the ones who found support in their neighbors, or who pushed themselves to find solutions, no matter how bleak the circumstances. And survival wasn't just an individual effort. When one family shared a coal or gave up some of their wood, they were contributing to the greater good of the village. Every small act of generosity was a pushback against the unrelenting cold, a way of saying, we survive together, or we don't survive at all. It's this communal struggle that shaped the culture of medieval villages. The cold had a way of breaking people down individually, but it also forged powerful connections. In the absence of warmth, there was solidarity. In the face of frostbite and hunger, there was sometimes kindness. These experiences didn't just teach villagers how to fight the cold. They built systems of reliance, a deeper understanding that everyone had a role in keeping the community alive. It didn't always work. Some winters were simply too harsh. Some fires couldn't be rekindled. But when they did pull through, it wasn't just the fire that left them stronger. It was the shared resilience of those who carried the heat, literally and figuratively, from one house to another. The bitter truth of medieval winter survival was that every night was a gamble. One mistake, a draft here, a missed shift there, and the consequences were immediate. Lives were fragile, bound to the constant flicker of light and heat at the heart of their homes. The fire wasn't just warmth, it was life itself. Losing it came at the greatest cost, but the struggle to maintain it also revealed the strength people found in one another when survival demanded they share whatever little they had. And that undeniable bond became, in its own way, the most important fire of all. Why was sharing warmth with neighbors, or even total strangers, sometimes the difference between survival and despair? In medieval villages, the answer wasn't complicated. It came down to the cold, hard facts of winter. No one could endure the freezing months entirely on their own. And so, survival wasn't just about layering your clothes, banking your fire, or huddling with livestock. It was about people. Villagers learned quickly that life during winter depended on one simple principle. Your neighbor's survival could be as important as your own. Because in those long, frigid months, when fires went out, or food supplies dwindled, the only real safety net was the community itself. Let's set the stage. Small medieval villages weren't just homes grouped together by convenience. They were webs of interdependence. One household's struggles could ripple outward, impacting the entire group. If a family lost their fire, it wasn't just their problem. Everyone understood that the longer they stayed cold, the higher the chances they'd need help, or worse, not survive the season at all. The same went for food stores running low, or a head of livestock falling sick. These weren't isolated struggles because resources in a small medieval village were often shared to some degree, whether through borrowing, trading, or outright necessity. Individual households might have appeared to operate independently, but the truth was much blurrier. Trust and generosity weren't just virtuous qualities, they were survival tactics. If you're wondering why sharing became such a central part of life, it starts with winter's harsh reality. Take food supplies as an example. When resources ran thin toward the end of the season, families pooled what they had. A neighbor might pitch in a sack of grain or a lump of salted meat, and it wasn't out of charity. It was simply understood that next week, or next season, the roles might reverse. People ate together. Communal feasts weren't celebrations so much as strategies. Some villagers would contribute what little they could muster, and the meal might be stretched out to dozens. Eating with the community also helped portion food more evenly, making sure no family suffered too much of the burden on their own. Homes, too, were shared in surprising ways. When a family couldn't keep their fire alive, neighbors would often step in. Sure, they'd send over an ember or a bundle of kindling if they had it to spare. But if supplies were tight, more drastic measures were taken. Whole families might temporarily move in with a neighbor, squeezing into already overcrowded quarters. Imagine one cramped house, smoky, full of drafty corners, with not one but two families trying to sleep, cook, and simply exist in the same space. It wasn't ideal by any stretch, but the alternative, leaving a family alone to face the cold, was unthinkable. And when it wasn't possible to host another family outright, communal warmth could sometimes mean nothing more than gathering together for a few hours at night, sharing stories, and huddling near the best burning hearth in town. But this kind of reliance wasn't always tidy or harmonious. Winter, with its limitations and constant demands, put pressure on even the tightest-knit communities. Sharing came with inevitable tension. Disputes over resources, like who had the right to use a communal mill, or how much firewood could be collected from shared forests, tended to flare up when supplies ran lowest. People fought over the smallest things, like who got access to the warmest corner of a shared house, or whose turn it was to fetch water from the frozen stream. And while generosity often ruled the day, desperation had a way of bringing out everyone's more selfish tendencies. If someone borrowed food or livestock and failed to repay, or worse, was thought to be withholding resources for themselves, it could fracture relationships in a heartbeat. In times of severe hardship, these fractures became difficult to avoid. If the entire village's resources were fading fast, life could resemble less of a supportive safety net and more of a tug-of-war. But here's the key difference. When survival truly hung in the balance and collapse seemed imminent, villagers often pivoted back toward cooperation. Old disputes were shelved. Grudges, no matter how bitter, were shrugged off. There wasn't room for stubbornness when the winter closed in, and everyone understood, even on the hardest days, that communal survival trumped personal frustration. At least, most of the time it did. And this wasn't just among adults. Children, though often overlooked in historical accounts, were a vital part of these communal survival systems. On freezing mornings, young boys and girls might run important errands for their parents, fetching stray embers from a neighbor's hearth or delivering sacks of grain between households. Some children gathered wood or helped tend the fires when adults were out working or simply too exhausted to manage. It wasn't glamorous work, but it reinforced a lesson no one in the village could forget. Survival was a shared responsibility, and age didn't exempt anyone from playing their part. Despite inevitable challenges, these communal survival efforts shaped more than just medieval winters. They played a role in the culture and values of entire villages. Living through the most unforgiving weather required a special kind of resilience, one that came from leaning into your connections rather than retreating into isolation. It's easy to imagine these shared struggles becoming defining memories for a generation. Surviving a particularly brutal winter together might mean talking about the time two families warmed themselves on the same hearth for months, or how the village gathered every last scrap to ensure no one went hungry. These were the moments that built a sense of unity, not just within individual villages, but across broader medieval culture. Think about it. Every small, practical decision reflected a bigger truth. The way villagers instinctively helped each other, even when resources were painfully slim, hinted at a deeply ingrained understanding that no one made it through the cold alone. And while conflict was inevitable in such a high-pressure environment, even the disputes were rooted in a shared system of dependence. People argued over resources not for greed, but because they understood how desperately important those resources were to the survival of everyone, themselves included. Few things capture human complexity quite like the simultaneous need for competition and collaboration. Even after winter ended, the effects of these survival tactics lingered. Villages often emerged from the cold with stronger communal bonds, or at the very least, a clearer understanding of their interdependence. New alliances might have formed between families who previously kept their distance, thanks to a winter spent sharing close quarters. Old rivalries may have faded, for no better reason than simple practicality. And what's more, these survival strategies, intense as they were, laid the groundwork for a cultural emphasis on cooperation that extended beyond just wintertime. The trust built in those months carried into planting, harvesting, and all the other collaborative work that shaped medieval life. It wasn't just survival. It was a cycle of reliance that defined villages in other ways too. Leaders, formal or informal, emerged from these moments, whether they were the ones who kept their fire going the longest, managed to share the most food, or simply had the wisdom to step in and mediate a dispute during particularly hostile times. And for everyone else, these moments served as reminders of how fragile life really was without the strength of the group holding it all together. At the heart of it, medieval villages weren't just surviving the cold. They were finding ways to thrive, even in the harshest circumstances. Every ember shared, every loaf of bread split, and every open door offered proof that solidarity mattered. The reality show of medieval life could easily have descended into chaos if everyone acted alone. But instead, these communities, flawed, tense, and occasionally argumentative as they were, turned the survival of the individual into a collective responsibility. And it was this mindset, this understanding of shared stakes, that defined survival not just during medieval winters, but throughout medieval life. Trust, generosity, frustration, and resilience all swirled together in a fragile dance that somehow worked more often than it didn't. Through the worst circumstances, villagers became living proof that sometimes the strongest shield you have isn't a thick wall or a roaring fire. It's the neighbor sitting next to you. What could modern life possibly learn from a medieval peasant struggling to survive the winter? At first glance, not much. After all, we live with central heating, electric blankets, and weatherproof materials. But if you take a closer look at their grit, ingenuity, and practicality, there's a lot to uncover. While life today feels worlds apart from smoky hearths and straw-filled mattresses, the strategies these peasants used to endure harsh conditions echo solutions we still value, or should value, in the face of modern challenges. Start with resourcefulness. Medieval peasants didn't have supermarkets, Amazon deliveries, or HVAC systems to bail them out. They worked with what they had. Homes were patched with mud or even dung. Embers were preserved for as long as possible. And when clothing tore, they didn't throw it out. They fixed it, no matter how rough the stitching. This wasn't because they wanted to. It was out of necessity. But here's the surprising part. This mindset, forced as it was, aligns eerily well with something we now call sustainability. Consider how today's world struggles with overconsumption. Fast fashion fills landfills, single-use products pile up, and energy waste poses significant environmental risks. But these medieval practices remind us what life could look like when you wring every ounce of usefulness out of the resources you already have. Their survival wasn't glamorous, but there's no denying it was efficient. Take firebanking, for example. Peasants would carefully bury embers under layers of ash to preserve them through the night, minimizing waste and conserving resources. In today's terms, that's the equivalent of keeping your energy bills low by adopting methods like insulation, efficient appliances, or even smart grids, where modern technology helps us use just what we need and no more. Firebanking was low-tech genius, born from the fact that you couldn't waste a single coal if you wanted to keep warm. That same mentality, applied today, feels increasingly relevant in a world grappling with energy shortages and climate change. But it wasn't just about using resources wisely. It was also about collaboration. Survival wasn't an individual endeavor. It was a collective one. A family might keep their fire going most nights, but when they couldn't, a neighbor would provide an ember or even take them in. Livestock were brought indoors for heat, not because it was pleasant, but because it kept everyone alive. The interdependence of medieval villages mirrored what we now call community resilience. Think about modern equivalents like community gardens, tool-sharing libraries, or neighborhood emergency plans. These ideas thrive on the same principle medieval peasants understood instinctively. There is strength in solidarity. When one household faltered, the community stepped in, because losing even one family weakened the entire village. And it went beyond neighbors sharing warmth. Consider the sheer creativity of their survival solutions. When clothing supplies ran short, they didn't turn to new purchases. They relied on what they had, dirt and all. Layers of wool, rarely washed, became natural insulators, with accumulated grease and grime acting as an extra barrier to the bitter cold. Now, this doesn't mean we should swear off soap and detergent, but it does shed light on modern fashion habits. How often do we buy clothes that wear out quickly, only to replace them with more cheap, poorly made garments? The medieval preference for sturdy fabrics like wool and linen, and the practical attitude of wearing them into the ground, offers an interesting alternative. Fix, rewear, rethink. These aren't just trendy buzzwords. They're echoes of an older, sustainable way of thinking. And let's talk housing. Mud, straw, and wattle construction were far from ideal, but peasants made it work with whatever materials were on hand. They found ways to insulate drafty homes with straw stuffed in gaps or rags lining cracks. These methods wouldn't win awards for craftsmanship, but they worked. Translating that into today's world, you could think about retrofitting old buildings to make them more energy efficient, sealing windows, improving insulation, or switching to renewable energy systems. The DIY spirit of medieval home survival, filling gaps however possible, rethinking what could serve as insulation, might inspire modern ways to reduce energy waste without always relying on high-tech solutions. It's not about mirroring medieval life, but adapting from their mindset of use what you have and make it last. Despite their inventiveness, simple tools weren't always enough. That's where their sense of community really shone. Communal sleeping arrangements, cramped and chaotic as they were, literally kept people alive. Families squeezed together, neighbors joined in, and no one hesitated to curl up wherever there was spare space. The warmth of a shared bed, while unimaginable to many modern people with their cozy separate bedrooms, was often the barrier between a brutal night and waking up intact. It's a stark reminder that survival isn't always about comfort, but connection. And in today's increasingly isolated society, where social bonds often fray, it's a poignant lesson. Human connection isn't just a luxury, it's a fundamental part of resiliency. This communal mentality extended beyond just physical warmth. Storytelling, singing, and shared meals strengthened bonds even in the harshest times. Peasants understood that survival wasn't just physical, it was mental too. Long winters could wear down morale, but these moments of connection helped carry people through. Modern parallels might be things like community centers, intergenerational programs, or co-housing initiatives, spaces and systems designed to keep people connected and supported, whether they're facing crises or simply the weight of everyday life. It's not about huddling for heat anymore, but the underlying idea remains the same. We're stronger together. And then there's their creativity in surviving off the land, which could also inform modern sustainable living. Bringing livestock indoors wasn't ideal, but it was incredibly resourceful. The animals didn't just provide heat, they also symbolized a mentality of interconnectedness. Today's equivalent might be community-supported agriculture or urban farming initiatives that bring people closer to the resources that sustain them. Rediscovering ways to integrate nature into our lives and environments, as peasants did on a daily basis out of necessity, could make our cities and towns not just greener, but more adaptable to future challenges. Speaking of future challenges, what can we take from all this as we face modern environmental crises, resource shortages, and economic instability? The recurring pattern here is adaptability. Medieval peasants didn't expect the outside world to save them from a harsh winter. They relied on what they could do themselves with the tools and knowledge they had on hand. That doesn't mean they succeeded every time. There were losses, harsh lessons, and limits to their creativity. But it does mean they understood something that feels increasingly relevant today. Survival depends on adaptability and community, not just on cleaning up after disaster strikes. To approach environmental challenges today, it wouldn't hurt to borrow from that perspective. Whether it's making homes more efficient, rediscovering the value of durable clothing, or fostering stronger community networks, the survival instinct medieval peasants lived by is something we can still learn from. And while it's easy to dismiss their lives as primitive or bleak, the ways they fought to stay warm, fed, and connected under some of the roughest conditions imaginable show just how much can be done with minimal resources and a lot of creativity. Ultimately, the tools, tactics, and people of medieval winters deserve more credit than history often gives them. Yes, theirs was a world of struggle, but it was also one of remarkable ingenuity. They didn't always conquer the cold, but they found ways to endure it, turning hardship into a shared communal challenge. And perhaps that's the real takeaway here. Survival doesn't just come down to technology or individual effort. It's a team sport, fueled by creativity, determination, and collective resilience. For medieval peasants, every ember shared, every meal split, and every night spent huddled together mattered. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it worked. And as we navigate modern challenges, we might just find that the lessons from their resilience, though centuries old, still hold warmth today. As you relax tonight, think about those medieval peasants, braving nights colder than most of us can imagine. With little more than smoky fires, patched up homes, and shared warmth, they turned survival into a communal achievement. Their story isn't just about enduring harsh winters. It's proof of human resilience and ingenuity when the odds were stacked against them. It's also a reminder of just how much we can adapt when we have no other choice. So before you go, if this journey through history resonated with you, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Sleep well and stay warm.